I'm glad you're here. Welcome. This is the first meeting of the Socratic Club for spring of this semester. The Socratic Club meets about once a month during the school session, and we take our name and inspiration from the Oxford Socratic Club, which was in existence at Oxford University during the mid-1900s. And it has some fame or notoriety because its president was famous Christian apologist and author C.S. Lewis, the guy who wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, if you've been to see the recent film, which is the third in the series, by the way. Our purpose today, though, is to talk about free speech, Catholic mission, and sponsorship. Controversial events pop up on campuses of all kinds all the time. That's nothing new or surprising. Universities have a kind of reputation for being fora where lots of interesting things take place. But controversial events pose a particular issue and problem for religiously oriented universities that have a mission, that have a particular identity that they wish to cultivate and defend. Sometimes the word sponsorship gets brought up. That's in the title of, at least I've put out several versions of the topic of our discussion today, but sponsorship is a term that sometimes pops up because inevitably universities are associated with views that are expressed on campus, and that raises a question: should a university be institutionally associated with or regarded as institutionally responsible for the content of presentations that take place on campus? You can see how this raises an immediate problem, because if a university is a forum for the free exchange of ideas, and at the same time a university has a tendency to be associated with views that are expressed, well, if you're going to have lots of ideas being thrown out, then inevitably people that come to speak are going to raise controversial issues, and the university can very well be associated with those views. This question of sponsorship, even though the word itself does not appear in Gonzaga's events policy, which we've got up here and our speakers may talk about. I don't know if you've ever bothered to look at this, but it's on Gonzaga's website. The word sponsorship, I can't remember now, maybe it does appear. I did read over it, but it was earlier this week. But the idea certainly is there, because on the one hand, the policy very explicitly states in a disclaimer, which is lower down, I believe, on the, or maybe it's higher up. A disclaimer explicitly says that the university should not be, it's at the bottom, okay.
Or maybe last one, you just go further down.
Yeah, that's what I thought. The university is not to be, there's the disclaimer right there, okay. The university is not to be confused with the views of particular speakers. And we can see why, if we're going to really allow a context of free speech, why the university would want to say that. But the policy also states that views that are likely to generate offense or confusion on the part of students, faculty, or the public or alums, that those views may very well be restricted. So the Gonzaga policy could be regarded as trying to steer a line between these two ways of thinking about the issue of sponsorship. But rather than hearing more from me about that, I've just tried to lay out the problem for you. We have two distinguished speakers today. Dr. Richard McClelland is from the Gonzaga University Philosophy Department, and David DeWolf is a professor of law at the Gonzaga University School of Law. And I'm very pleased to say that they've duked it out before at the Socratic Club. They're a nice pair to have. They're a very productive pair to have, because Dr. McClelland is a specialist in analytically oriented philosophy, which is known for making distinctions and clarifying points. And Mr. DeWolf, as a lawyer, certainly knows all about making distinctions and clarifying points. So they're a good pair to have. And without any further ado, then, I'll ask Dr. McClelland to come speak to us.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here once again in the Socratic Club. In The Anatomy of Melancholy, Robert Burton says, "The university is a paradise. Rivers of knowledge are there." Anybody who has worked or lived in universities knows that this is not entirely true. Of course, as I recall, a very ancient form of paradise also had a snake that led to various difficulties. Universities are also an important social invention in Western culture, in my view, one of the most brilliant that has ever been achieved. And they have handsomely paid back the societies who have allowed them to exist. At the basis of every university, I take it, lies a fundamental social contract between them and usually the powers that be. The oldest universities, founded in the Middle Ages, depended upon a charter, and universities still do. This university has a charter, for example, granted to it by legal authority. In the medieval university, the charter was usually with the monarch, or it might be with the pope, or it might be with the emperor, as the case may be. The fundamental terms of the contract were that the civil or governing authority would guarantee the independence and freedom of the university as a community. Independence for, at least the most part, from external interference with its internal affairs and its life. In exchange, the university effectively guaranteed to supply a stock of well-trained graduates to that society to fill essential social roles. In the Middle Ages, they were known as clerks, and they were especially important in the church for its various functions, important also to the civil community in the form of lawyers, doctors, and the like. This function of the university, of course, has expanded enormously, but it seems to me that the fundamental contract remains the same. In exchange for our independence, we agree to function as an educational institution which supplies society with one of its most vital commodities, if that's not, that may not be the best choice of word there, namely a well-trained and educated citizenry, especially in disciplines that are highly technical and upon which society depends for its own health and well-being. Now we're considering today, in some ways, a tension that, as David suggested, I think is built into all universities and colleges, not just those that are religiously based. My own education was carried out in institutions which were either not explicitly religious or were indeed explicitly anti-religious. It's an irony to me that I've spent most of my teaching career in Catholic universities. This is also probably deeply shocking to my Protestant forebears, but there it is, these things happen. But even my American and undergraduate college, Reed College, which is noted for the degree of freedom that it gives its members and outside persons who come to the college, especially when it comes to speech, had a sense of mission and a sense of identity, and did not allow just anything to occur. Though I recall vividly the invitation that students sent to Timothy Leary at Harvard in the winter of 1969. Timothy Leary was at that time the guru of drug usage in the United States. And we invited him to come to campus for a week, which he did. The first night, I remember vividly, he sat in the lotus position on top of a table, intoning his mantra: tune in, turn on, drop out. This went on for about 30 minutes. What Dr. Leary did not realize is there were people in the audience who knew a great deal more about psychedelic drugs than he did. What was particularly instructive to me was that we found Leary ludicrous. The longer he talked and the longer we got to know him over the early days of that week, the more ludicrous we found him and his message. And in fact, he was finally laughed off the campus by the student body and left after 3 days. I thought this was very instructive. And why it might be instructive is the main issue that concerns me today. It has been widely recognized and is recognized at Gonzaga that one of the fundamental, perhaps necessary, conditions for universities achieving their pedagogical and research aims is freedom of thought and expression. The issue, of course, for most colleges and universities is how free. What degrees of freedom will be permitted? I think our experience has shown that a very high degree of such freedom is very valuable and may indeed be a necessary condition for achieving our pedagogical and research missions. Of course, such degrees of freedom have been often violated in the past. Colleges and universities are not actually paradises, as we know. But it seems to me that there are good reasons for suggesting that colleges and universities as educational institutions have a good reason to place a high value on a high degree of freedom of thought and expression. If we do go that route, then an interesting question arises: what constitutes sponsorship in such a setting? And I have something to say about that before I'm finished. A further reason why universities and colleges perhaps have thrived as much in North America as they have, and especially in the United States, it seems to me is due to the noble tradition of the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which also establishes important rights to freedom of thought and expression. Though, of course, the First Amendment has been debated widely, has often been compromised in the history of our nation's events, and perhaps this also, how shall we say, contested quality of that amendment is also common ground between civil society and universities and colleges. Freedom of thought and expression, it seems to me, has always been, and probably always will be, a contested value. Now, my own experience and my own traditions suggest erring on the side of a very wide degree of latitude of freedom of thought and expression. Suppose we do. Again, really for whatever reasons, then I ask myself, is there any form of speech or expression that I would not permit in a college and university? How open should they be? My inclination here is to say, I do not know. I do not know what the absolute boundaries are, but my inclination is to err on the side of latitude. If it were my choice, if they allowed me to run the zoo, which thank God nobody's going to allow, I would let all comers come and let them say what they have to say. Because if what they say is false, sooner or later, debate, discussion, research, investigation will reveal that. If what they say is confused, similarly, sooner or later, in the open debate, this will become clear. If what they have to say is worthless, this also will become clear. And so it goes. Now, suppose we do err on this side, then how must we understand the nature of sponsorship? What is the relationship between the college or university to what goes on within its confines if one allows for such latitude? Well, one thing that sponsorship does not constitute under such conditions is subscription. That is, it does not constitute a relationship whereby the college or university is held or could reasonably be held to subscribe to the views of those who speak in its confines, whether members of the university or outside persons invited in. Neither, of course, is it equivalent to identification. Again, no matter how that may be construed or misconstrued by others. Indeed, it's not really then even, I think, any kind of attachment to the content of such expression or speech per se, or merely because the institution has provided a forum for such expressions. Rather, sponsorship would be, I think, a relationship to the occasion of expression or thought, of the authorship of the framework within which it occurs. I'm tempted here by an analogy to psychotherapeutic practice. All schools of psychotherapy, however they describe themselves, subscribe to the view that one of the fundamental purposes of the therapist and one of the fundamental responsibilities of the therapist in a psychotherapeutic arrangement is to provide a framework within which the therapy proceeds. The framework is constituted by some very ordinary and simple things, as, for example, regularity of appointments. One makes an appointment to see the therapist. One shows up on time, so does the therapist. The regularity of appointments, the fact that one shows up on regular occasions at the same place. The proffering of bills and the expectation that they will be paid in a prompt and reasonable fashion are part of the framework. There is, of course, a great deal more that's required. One of the things I learned when I underwent training for this kind of work was the importance of holding the framework steady. Indeed, my own teachers insisted that the framework be held rigid. When I asked them why is that, they said because there's all kinds of things that are going to occur inside the framework, and it needs to be a container. Consider, for example, what happens if you have a floridly psychotic patient who perhaps more than any other needs an external framework as a container of the psychosis, of their delusions, even of their hallucinations. Without a rigid framework, without this kind of containing function, no therapy can proceed. Now, what all schools of psychotherapeutic practice have also discovered is that if you provide a suitable framework, those frameworks can often contain some of the most remarkable events imaginable. They can contain, for example, the reliving, the redescription, even the discovery of traumatic events, of delusions, of hallucinations. And of course, they also contain and are often the cause of great creativity. Now, it seems to me that if we are thinking about freedom of thought and expression in the very latitudinarian sense, in which I would find it useful and helpful, that we are looking for the institution to provide a similar kind of function of containment, the provision of a framework within which such thought and expression can occur. Now, there are, of course, a wide variety of costs attaching to understanding sponsorship in this way. It would require a community which is prepared to tolerate a wide variety of events, including surprise, disturbance, offense, shock, creativity. It will be no surprise to many of you that many institutions, even institutions devoted to higher education, are often not the friend of creativity. They must be prepared to, of course, to entertain opposition, both internal and external, disagreement, even attack on basic values held very dear by the institution, the sheer difference of competing opinions, and, of course, the elation, the excitement, and the rest of creative encounters with competing points of view. If I press my analogy with psychotherapeutic practice a little further, only robustly healthy and well-integrated personalities can provide a framework within which psychotherapy proceeds creatively and healthfully. Similarly with colleges and universities, if we are to act as a container for freedom of expression and thought, especially of a very latitudinarian variety, then we too have to be robustly healthy, well-integrated, how shall we say, fictive persons. Notoriously, many colleges and universities are not. It might be an item of discussion that we could take up as to what might constitute some of the conditions for such robust health in an institutional framework such as the ones that you and I live and work in. We might also ask what would be required, what would be some of the specific and concrete elements of containment. The alternative vision, it seems to me, if I was to push as sharp an alternative as I could think of, would be a very different understanding of sponsorship. So perhaps at the other end of the spectrum would be the notion of identification, subscription, and attachment, whereby the institution would regularly be understood to sponsor in the sense of agreement with what gets presented, in which case freedom of expression and thought is likely to be sharply limited in such an institutional setting. And of course there are plenty of such institutions around, including colleges and universities. In my experience, Gonzaga University is somewhere in between the two extremes of this spectrum. We might also ask and seek to answer in discussion just where you might see us, whether at present or in the recent past, on that spectrum. On that view, sponsorship, it seems to me, amounts to a kind of confessional relationship between the events that take place on the campus or in its confines or in its program and the institution and its sense of identity taken together. Now, a further matter that I'd like to suggest, though I have no idea exactly how to relate this to my previous remarks, so I've just tacked it on, item 3 on the list. I'm not sure exactly what the relationship is to this. Colleges and universities are institutions, and ours is an institution. In a recent, very illuminating essay, John Searle, a philosopher who teaches at the University of California at Berkeley, has attempted to describe what is an institution. And the device he uses, which I find myself very illuminating, is the notion of constitutive rules. The analogy here is with games. Games are partially constituted by the rules that make them up. So if you think of a game such as chess, for example, the game of chess is at least partially, and indeed in large measure, constituted by the rules that tell you how to play it. What such constitutive rules do is that they assign status to the objects or the events that make up the game. A knight in chess is assigned a certain kind of status in terms of its function. And those functions are laid down by the rules. The difference between a pawn and a queen is likewise established by those rules. Institutions are like games in this regard. If you think about economic institutions, for example, most of you may be carrying around money with you. Anybody got money? I mean real, actual, hard cash. I haven't carried money for a while, or at least since I left Italy a month ago. In the plastic economy, one can go for a surprisingly long period of time without carrying any cash. My children used to call my wallet the magical wallet, because you opened it and there was money inside. That was before they had any idea about where the money came from. Occasionally they'd say, "Where's the magical wallet?" And I would produce it. There would be no money inside. They'd say, "What's up with that?" Now, these pieces of, in our case, they're mostly linen. They're not really paper at all. We call it paper money, but it's not actually paper. What makes it money are the economic rules that govern this institution, that give it that status. Rules which we agree, for the most part, to follow and conform our practice to. We could run through a wide variety of institutional settings using this kind of analysis. It's often possible to tell what the constitutive rules of an institution are. Now, you know as well as I do that institutions frequently have two sets of rules. I'm very pleased that Michael Maher is here today. My memory is, Father Maher, that when not too long after I first met you in Florence, that you told me the following story. The financial police showed up in his office one day and said, "We'd like to see your books." The financial police in Italy, by the way, one of its many police forces, there are what, 4 or 5 in Italy? they're very powerful. These are the guys that put the head of Parmalat in jail, one of the biggest employers in Italy. Father Maher replied, fine, here are the books, to which the police calmly replied, no, we want to see the real books. To which, and very much to his credit, he replied, we only have one set of books here. Is that right? Is that the way the story went?
Yeah, it went, it was an Italian, it said, "Volete libri, we want to see your books." Libri is plural for books in Italian. And I said, "Scusa, sono frate onesta." I said, "I'm an honest piece." "Ci sono solo uno." There's only one book.
Like many other things, it's more elegant and efficient in Italian than the retelling in English. Institutions, of course, often have two sets of rules. The explicit rules that are actually shown to the public or to other members of the institution, and the implicit rules, which are seldom described. These are often rules that constitute the creation and distribution of power inside the institution, that create status for the members of the institution, statuses of various kinds, that may establish the manner in which information is controlled inside the institution, that might establish the tenor of what is loosely called the ethos of the institution, and so on. And notoriously, many institutions do indeed have at least two sets of such rules. I suspect that in the actual event of how colleges and universities resolve the questions attaching to sponsorship and the question of how wide or how narrow shall freedom of thought and expression be, is largely done by the implicit rules, not the explicit rules. And this also might be an item which we could take up in discussion as to what might be, how shall we say, the hidden rules, the implicit rules of our own institutional setting, at least as you have experienced them, or as any of us may have experienced them. Now, I want to finish with a couple of brief quotations. These are drawn from two mid-20th century commentators on the nature of creativity. Because it seems to me that freedom of thought and expression in colleges and universities has creativity as one of its main aims. This is Donald Winnicott. Donald Winnicott was a psychoanalyst and a pediatrician, interestingly enough. He maintained a pediatric practice throughout his professional career. He lived and worked in London for a long time, especially in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. This is from a book that he wrote in 1971 called Playing in Reality. It is creative apperception, Winnicott says, more than anything else that makes the individual feel that life is worth living. It is creative apperception, more than anything else that makes the individual feel that life is worth living. Contrasted with this is a relationship to external reality, which is one of compliance. The world and its details being recognized, but only as something to be fitted in with, or demanding adaptation. Compliance carries with it a sense of futility for the individual, and is associated with the idea that nothing matters, and that life is not, in the end, worth living. So far, Donald Winnicott, who himself was enormously creative. Winnicott invented a game, interestingly enough. It's called the Squiggle game. He invented it for use with his very young patients. He saw children in therapeutic arrangements, and he discovered early on the value of this kind of game. He would give the child a piece of paper and a pencil and say, make a mark on the paper, any mark that you wish, and they would do so. He would then take the paper and make a mark on the paper, hooking it up with the one made by the child. The paper would be passed back and forth between them, each of them making a mark in turn of some kind. I've seen some of the drawings that result from this practice. They are absolutely astonishing. Winnicott's view was that this was a way in which unconscious processes and contents would find expression, sometimes to the total and utter astoundment of both parties. The total and utter astonishment. For example, one of the children that he created made a mark on the paper, and he made one. They went back and forth for the best part of an hour. And what appeared on the paper, which neither of them had thought of deliberately or consciously, was the outline of a locomotive. This was a child who was mute. He stopped talking after he had wandered away from home and found himself on the railroad tracks that ran nearby his home, and barely escaped being run over by a locomotive, a real, actual one, which was recalled in the drawing that he and Winnicott made together. I love that story about Winnicott, the squiggle game. Himself a very creative man. Marion Milner was one of his students, also wrote about creativity, herself became a professional psychotherapist and also a painter of some note. She says this in an essay she wrote in 1957 on creativity: "For there are obviously many circumstances in which it is not safe to be absent-minded." Her view was that creativity required a certain absent-mindedness. It needs a setting, both physical and mental. It requires a physical setting in which we are freed for the time being from the need for immediate practical and expedient action. And it requires a mental setting, and this is the part that especially interests me about her comment. A mental setting, an attitude, both in the people around and in oneself. A tolerance of something which may at moments look very like madness. A tolerance of something which may at moments look very like madness. I often have the experience, and I'm sure that many of you have been on the other end of this, not particularly with me, but with others, but I often have students who come in who are facing the task of writing an essay or a paper for some course that I'm teaching. And they may express great confusion about the subject at hand. I always say this is very promising. Confusion is promising. Because confusion suggests just the kind of precondition for creativity that Milner says often resembles something very like madness. One reason why I'm fond of latitudinarian policies of free speech and expression in institutional settings, I think, is precisely because they are an important precondition for creativity inside those institutions. Now, I haven't answered the question, what would be the best policy? I haven't answered the question of what would be best for Gonzaga University to do, and I haven't said a thing about the events policy. But we can take these matters up in discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. My impression of the Socratic Club is that it gets its name from the fact that when you're done with it, you feel like drinking hemlock. So, on that, with that expectation, I'll proceed to answer Richard's very thoughtful introduction here. It's awfully warm in here, is it just me?
It's very warm.
The number of fewer people fall asleep here. I want to see if I can capture Richard's proposal. He's made a sort of proposition here, and I want to address it. When I first announced it, it seemed fairly clear to me that he was proposing an all-comers policy. That is, that the university should be less concerned about filtering the types of speakers or information that were expressed on campus, and by taking a more permissive stance, it would help both the climate for creativity and expression. It would also enforce a kind of discipline. Later, it seemed to me he somewhat qualified his proposal by describing this framework in which the this policy makes sense. And he described the circumstances at his alma mater at Reed, where the community did have a kind of cohesive philosophy that was, in effect, had the antibodies present to fight off the infection of bad ideas. That rather than relying upon a kind of paternalistic protection by the administration, the community itself was able to separate the wheat from the chaff. Now, I think it's important to, I will want Richard later to explain whether or not this framework, this sort of culture of perhaps a kind of stability is a necessary precondition for his all-comers policy, or whether one should adopt the all-comers policy even within a community not yet ready, in effect, to live within its constraints, or to embody those restraints or practice those restraints, that over time it would sort of naturally occur. I was quite taken by his analogy to the therapeutic process, that the therapist provides the process provides these kinds of constraints, this framework in which creativity is allowed to work a kind of healing process whereby the therapist and the patient do this difficult creative work. It, I think, is also closely related to the ideal of a university, that in the, I was trying to find the name of the Greek myth. Is it not Medusa that, is it Perseus that goes after Medusa in the myth, and he has to use his shield? He can't look at her directly. He has to use his shield to see her reflection and chop her head off. Well, this is quite apt as a metaphor for what happens in the therapeutic process. Just as the child couldn't talk about locomotives directly, had to do it sort of indirectly through painting or working on this set of squiggles that eventually emerged into a recognition of what traumatic event was blocking his ability to speak. And so universities offer a way of allowing us to explore those aspects of our culture, for that matter of ourselves, that are in need of some kind of healing. And but they do require this structure, and they require kind of discipline. It would be dangerous to confront the issues directly because they, in their raw state, have the power to overwhelm us. To the extent that we're talking about the role of universities, I think it is worth remembering that the universities have their origin in the church. That the church essentially invented universities as part of its own evangelism, really, and in a recognition and a kind of high confidence that a search for the truth was closely related to the advancement of the ideals within the church. I think today we labor under a much different concept of universities, at least of Catholic universities, in which the search for truth is at odds with the kind of restrictive, uptight, fraidy cat hierarchy of the church that won't let things sort of follow the truth wherever it leads. And this image, unfortunately, is quite prevalent even among people who work or are students or teach at Catholic universities, in part because I believe there's an inadequate recognition of the way in which the search for truth proceeds. I think it's very helpful to read, for example, Pope John Paul II's encyclicals on faith and reason, his encyclical on the splendor of truth, his encyclical or his pastoral letter, Ex Corde Ecclesiae, about universities, that the search for truth is not a subject looking at an object. That is, we are not these autonomous agents following the truth wherever it leads, but rather we are ourselves in a path toward our own self-discovery, and part of our own self-discovery, the search for truth, is a recognition of our own limitations. Unless we are in touch with that reality, unless we exercise our own faith, we are unable to engage in a real search for truth. As he described it in Faith and Reason, faith and reason are these two wings upon which the human spirit ascends, and one without the other is really incapable of flight, so to speak. Now again, I think the modern concept of the search for truth, or the First Amendment, or freedom of speech, or the like, is more with Oliver Wendell Holmes, the famous American jurist, where Holmes believed in the First Amendment because he essentially was skeptical of any comprehensive worldview to adequately sort of be the definitive statement of political organization. Essentially, that we were on a search, a journey of discovery, and who knows where the end might lie. The purpose of freedom of speech is to allow us to, essentially for the law to channel this change in intellectual fashions in a sort of orderly way, without imposing on the political structure any preconditions or any fixed assumptions about what was good or what was bad. It's a profoundly relativistic view of what the law is. Again, it seems to me the Catholic universities, in their self-understanding, come a lot closer to the real search for truth, which is that it is intimately related to a spiritual journey and indeed a commitment to a kind of personal relationship with the truth, as John Paul describes it in Veritatis Splendor, that the truth is not an object, it is a subject, it is a person. There is one who is the truth. And if you are claiming to be in search of the truth, you have to make make some relationship with that truth in order to achieve what you claim you have set out to do. So again, I think there are we have a lot of, as I think Richard would agree with me here, we have a lot of kind of preparatory work to do in understanding what terms we are using and how they really apply. Again, if you, I guess what I'd like to do is turn more specifically to the policy to, in effect, defend why the policy makes sense, why it's preferable to an all-comers policy. And the first, I think, is to rehabilitate this idea of sponsorship itself, and that it is a useful term. It is certainly true that the university sponsors many speakers. There are many speakers who come to the university whose presence and whose views are in effect offered to the community as worthy of being at least considered or if not admired. We have commencement speakers. We have other endowed lectureships and other events on campus. We have masses, the Red Mass, for example, in the law school, where we typically have a guest homilist who's presented to the community as someone worth listening to. I don't think there's any question that as to that class of persons, there is sponsorship by the university. There's an investment by the university in bringing these people to campus, occupying space, occupying sort of the attention of the community, and it would be foolish to think that this was essentially an unregulated supermarket of ideas in which I have no control over the content here, take of it what you will. Even with respect to other types of speakers who appear on campus or other events that occur on campus, there is the implicit impression that's given that someone in the university thought this was worth our time to pay attention to. And the purpose of the events policy was to recognize that under some circumstances, the presentation of an idea or of an activity or of a speaker could cause substantial confusion as to what values the university stood for. Again, in the same way that you would choose a commencement speaker with some care. Again, the controversy at Notre Dame over having President Obama speak at the graduation, or whether or not there was a miscommunication of the university's ideals. And obviously you can have different opinions about the merits of that choice, but again, I don't think anyone would disagree that the choice of such speakers involves the university in making a kind of, in communicating to the public, here is someone we'd like you to pay attention to. Now, I do think that there is a distinction between those sort of, those persons who are held up for some sort of recognition or honor, and the variety of speakers who may be brought to campus for other purposes. So you may have a speaker who's, let's suppose, for example, you had Tiger Woods come to speak to the golf club. If he were coming to speak to the family, formation class, it would be quite different from having Tiger Woods come to speak to the golf club about how to hit a golf ball. So people come with different kinds of contributions, and it is certainly true that not everything they say, it's one of the reasons for that disclaimer at the end. If you invite Tiger Woods to come speak to the golf club or to the students in the golf program, you want to be clear that he may say things in the course of his presentation that wouldn't be endorsed by, shouldn't be understood to be the message we want students to go away with. Obviously, many other statements that he might make would be, and in fact you might bring him to come talk to your family formation class under circumstances where his message was, here's what I've learned, here are the reasons to behave in a responsible way. Now, there is perhaps a third class of speakers, and these are the ones that are essentially in the filter list, or they're candidates for resistance, for the policy to kick in and say, no, wait a minute, hold on, don't do this. Again, You could have someone like, let's say, Hugh Hefner, who came and spoke on campus about, opportunities in the publishing world. Well, wait a minute. The impression could be left that we are proposing to students that the way in which he made a living, his kind of journalism, was a model we were holding up for students to emulate. And again, the criterion in which the university says, slow down, we have a criterion here, which is, if I can scroll this back a little bit here, the criterion is we're going to forbid this if item number 3 there from the top, there's a substantial risk, no, that's wrong.
Number 2.
Yeah, number 2. The speech or event is likely to confuse the public. That's a pretty high criterion, by the way. Likely, not potentially, but is likely to confuse the public or students about or offend the university's core values or mission as a Catholic Jesuit humanistic institution by advocating positions or activity contrary to Catholic teachings, and the person or group seeking permission refuses to accept provisions for appropriate response or counter-programming. Again, the question would be, is there a likelihood that someone picking up the newspaper or getting an email or getting some other notification of an event on campus would say, wait a minute, what's he doing at this university? Have they changed their position, or there's a new dispensation, or what's going on here? And again, I think this kind of comes back to, and I'll wrap this up in a few minutes. This comes back to the question that Richard that I thought was raised at the beginning, which is, do we have sufficient kind of confusion within the university that people are likely to be, particularly outsiders, are likely to be confused about who we are and what we stand for? I think it's a really, I think we just have to be candid about the fact that on many issues where, let's take sexual orientation, for example, there's really a lot of confusion about exactly what the university stands for with respect to issues about sexual orientation. What is the relationship between official church teaching and the message that the university is trying to convey about sexual orientation? It's precisely at that point that it is more difficult to have an all-comers policy in which the effect of the all-comers policy is essentially to shift the climate or shift the balance of power, so to speak, within that arena. And in fact, I hope I'm not too mean-spirited or cynical to think that some would use the event's policy or would use the occasion of inviting a speaker precisely to change to sort of make a statement. It's not so much, gee, I really would like to hear this idea. I have no other way of finding out what this person has to say. The reason for inviting someone to campus is to kind of make it a controversial event, change what is being thought about as the kind of prevailing wisdom. So I guess at this point, since we're about half an hour to go here, I'd like to turn it back to Richard and kind of ask the question, is it not true, well, I'll put it this way, is it not true that the precondition that you set of having a kind of campus maturity that in which the ideas could be safely presented without producing a misunderstanding, that we aren't there at this institution, and that until we are, an all-comers policy really wouldn't be to our advantage. And I don't know, you utter your
Go ahead.
thoughts.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you, David.
Thank you, David. I just want to make a couple of brief replies, and then we can open things up for discussion. Like Justice Holmes, I am inclined to be skeptical about the value of overarching worldviews, at least many of them, but I don't think that such skepticism necessarily conduces to relativism, and I don't think he was a relativist. In terms of the question that David left us with, I have two difficulties with this. The difficulty with requiring maturity in advance of the practices and exercises which give rise to maturity is that maturity is never arrived at. Moreover, David's argument is at least somewhat circular, for in seeking to defend a view of sponsorship and a more limited notion of freedom of thought and expression. He is presupposing the very notion of sponsorship which he is seeking to defend. Now, it may well be that there are members or constituents of the university or its public which make the mistake of supposing that anything that happens on the university is somehow represents the university's views. But if so, then I take it we have, at least with regards to my all-comers policy, and I do favor an all-comers policy, David, you're quite right about that. Should come out from the cover and admit that. I would allow anybody whatsoever to come and speak about anything whatsoever. In favoring that, I might well take on the burden of a further educational enterprise with regard to those constituents that make the mistake of confusing sponsorship with identity subscription and the other things that I considered. Well, that's sometimes what goes with the educational enterprise is its broadening to other groups. In any case, it seems to me that Gonzaga University is capable of a great deal more maturity than it is often allowed to practice. And I think that's as much as I wish to say at the time. So perhaps we could open up to questions either to Dr. DeWolf or to myself.
Or just general comment.
Or just general comments, certainly.
You're the ringmaster, David.
Do you want to?
Well, you two can, David, why don't you go on up front? And really, the approach we take here at the Socratic Club is that conversation is a pathway to clarifying issues and finding the truth. So if you have questions, comments, you want a soapbox to stand on for a minute, go for it.
Yeah, we'll practice Richard's all-comers policy. Go ahead.
So as a business major, I kind of looked at it as from an economic standpoint and how
I think
like
the university
free market
does too.
the free market regulates itself. And so if you took Dr. McClelland's all-comers policy, wouldn't the free market of the students regulate itself and vote with not only their attendance, but with their voices? And B, wouldn't, from that free market policy, we get the best available product, which would be the speakers?
Well, using your analogy though, in the free market, what you have are choices that people make. I go to a movie theater to watch a movie. I don't go there to watch, the audience takes a vote on what they want to watch. I want them to assure me the product, the narrow product that I have selected. And although universities within themselves have a degree of a sort of marketplace of ideas, they also exist within a larger marketplace of different kinds of universities. When you chose to come to Gonzaga University, you chose it over other places that were different. It isn't that the best thing a university could do is be all things to all people. It has to choose a more narrow focus to say, this is who we are. So maintaining that product quality in sort of the business context means that you do exclude some things. And so when you walk into Starbucks, there are things you expect to find at Starbucks, and there are things that you freely accept are not going to be there, even though perhaps a lot of the people sitting there at the table say, yeah, I like that. But in order for Starbucks to be who it is, it has to have a certain ability to narrow its focus. So just using that business model, it seems to me that it supports the idea of specialization and putting limitations on the university, rather than thinking that every university will strive to be as everything to everybody as it could possibly be. There's another question.
Before we get to another question, it seems to me there's good reason to doubt the analogy. Marketplace of ideas is not like an economic marketplace. Speaking as a socialist, I'm appalled to have it suggested that all commerce policy would be an unregulated market. I think unregulated markets historically have always gone in one direction, and it's been most unfortunate. Nobody practices unregulated markets. But my main objection there is that I think we've got a somewhat misleading analogy, because this is not economic activity. Sorry, you
I was thinking about the analogy, so now I don't want to.
I don't roll over and play down.
No,
I ask you the analogy if you can.
I mean, all analogies limp, as the saying goes, but I do think that there is some value in looking at the behavior of systems. And I think that Richard himself, to some extent, drew upon the experience that he had at Reed College, that there is a kind of natural process by which better ideas succeed and weaker ideas are pushed out. So there's a kind of, if there isn't a marketplace, if you don't like that, there's competition of ideas in which, in a sort of, although just as you abominate the marketplace, I abominate Charles Darwin, but there's a certain Darwinian aspect to the world of ideas. Go ahead.
So I guess what I'm wondering is, without competition and like competing speakers and all comers, how do you get to that better idea? I mean, if students are going to different movie theaters, then I mean, I don't know.
Well, and obviously it is not as though, I mean, I am not in favor of the more monochrome, the world of ideas, the better the education. But again, in the same way that Starbucks offers you a variety within a certain range, Gonzaga University should offer you variety within a particular kind of field. So within the world of a Christian understanding of the world, there should be all kinds of diversity and opportunity for spirited debate and so forth. What the rather limited proposition for which I'm contending is that there is a point of diminishing returns, that within that diversity there is a boundary line beyond which, instead of improving things, it actually gets worse. Just as you wouldn't offer a class in astrology, Holocaust denial, 9/11 truthers, etc. And of course people would put intelligent design in the same basket, and I'm often victimized by this kind of thinking as an advocate of intelligent design, but acknowledging that there can be mistakes in deciding what you let in and what you leave out. I just think that's inevitable, and it shouldn't be viewed as a weakness. But it should be exercised with prudence. Just as the application of that policy, where is there likely to be confusion? Where do we need counter-programming? Where can we assume, hey, this is not a problem?
But as students, do you think we have a responsibility to maybe challenge the boundaries of that policy so we can find where the best variety comes from?
Well, you're hormonally driven to do it, I'll give you that. I mean, it's in the nature of the beast that you're inevitably gonna do it, whether it's, you know, your skirts have to be below the knee, or, you know, you can't wear any facial hair, or whatever the restriction is in which, gee, youth will rebel, and test those boundaries for better or for worse. That's going to happen. The question is whether the institution properly resists that. And it seems to me Richard conceded a lot of that by saying you need a framework. Every process, no matter how creative, requires some rigidity in order to contain this creative process.
David has very clearly, and I think correctly, identified the weakest point of my presentation, which is this aspect of the framework. What we probably finally disagree about is what is part of the framework, and to what extent does the framework determine or leave radically underdetermined the content of what goes on within it. I'm in favor of institutional arrangements which provide a framework, a very minimal kind of framework, enough to establish a forum in which a wide range of ideas can be freely expressed, debated, applied, and the like. And you know, if some people find this confusing, well, then we should try to help them not be confused about it.
Go ahead.
So you brought up the Starbucks analogy
Yes.
a few times, and I think one problem with that is that, at least the way you described it, is that the consumer just passively goes into Starbucks, buys what's available that Starbucks has decided they can choose from, and so on. But a university seems to be more of a community of people, and the students are active participants in what the university is and does, or should be at least. And you said earlier in your discussion that one of the ideas of sponsorship is that when a speaker comes to the university, it suggests that somebody thinks it's worth hearing, somebody at the university. Quite often it seems to be the students are the ones that actually want someone there, and that's true. And what the university has done in the past, I think the Vagina Monologues is an example. Students want it here. And the university is acting more like Starbucks and saying, no, we have a market, strategy here. We have to market ourselves to the community and so on, against the will of the students in a sense, who are really shouldn't be thought of as mere passive consumers in their education.
What if some students wanted Westboro Baptist Church to come here and speak?
They did. I mean, more or less. They came to Eastern, for example, at the same time. They were at Eastern on campus.
They were on campus at Eastern?
They were on campus because it's a public institution.
Right.
They were allowed. And whether students wanted there or not, I think what you would get and what they did get was for the really small group of people who were there that were in favor of Westboro, you had a massive outpouring of people protesting it. There were discussions on campus, on and on, that do exactly the kind of thing that show just how absurd they are. So having them come on campus doesn't seem like a real liability to the school. And I don't think most people thought Eastern was somehow degraded for it, that Eastern was somehow complicit in their absurdity. I mean, it was pretty obvious for, I think, 99.9% of the population or more that they're selling.
What if 20% of the population agreed with the folks at Westboro?
Then I think that's even more reason that they should be allowed to speak on campus. I mean, there is a large part of that community that wants that group of people there. It's not like the students aren't part of the university. The university isn't just the administration and the buildings, and that's what constitutes the core of the university. The students are an active part of what it is to be a university. They shouldn't just be ignored.
I like this analogy with Starbucks. I think Starbucks, what Starbucks has done very brilliantly is they've managed to sell the worst coffee in the world to the largest part of the world. And part of why they get away with it is because they give you like 15 different choices, but they're all bad. It's really dreadful coffee. And you will see me down at the Starbucks drinking it from time to time. It says the French would say faute de mieux, in the absence of anything better. The best coffee in the world is made by Torfazioni, and so it goes. But I like also the case you suggest. I do favor an all-comers policy, and at least I certainly favor erring in that direction, and for the reason that you give. It seems to me that students, university students, are quite capable of exercising their critical faculties in such forms to consider the merits and demerits of a wide range of ideas and their application. And the more they get the opportunity to exercise those skills, the stronger they get.
Well, Mark.
I really, Richard, what you're saying about structure is interesting because I think that's a key idea. I think this conversation, it interests me very much. I think what a prior context of the conversation are what are the values of the institution. Because values always, where there's a value, there's always a system for implementation. When we value food, and so we have the COG. You know, we value this, we value defense, we have police. And so for me, I was thinking about this talk, and I said to myself, well, there's nothing more volatile than an idea except hydrochloric acid. So if we think of how we handle hydrochloric acid on this campus, hydrochloric acid is very volatile, it's very dangerous, it's very risky, but we have it on campus in a very, very careful modality. Why? Because we recognize it as dangerous and we don't want it out. Why? Because we value safety. That's our overriding thing. On the other hand, if this was terrorist U, we'd have hydrochloric acid going everywhere. Why? Because our values are different. And so I think whatever the grounding of this conversation is, what are the values that we're trying to get at? And I find it's interesting, and you know, David, you quoted John Paul II on the search for truth, is that the question is this going to lead us to the truth? And what I think is we're sort of infatuated in this country with freedom of speech. That whatever it's got, if anytime you put up restriction of freedom of speech, everyone goes ballistic. But we know in our own experience that freedom of speech is restricted, but you can't yell in a crowded theater. Why? Because that freedom is always constricted by a greater value, safety. And so I think that the question, especially for a place like Gonzaga, is what do we value? Ultimately, what do we value? And what are going to be the best means by which we will attain those ends? And, for example, in some case, a corrosive substance is allowable, but only under very clear circumstances. And that, but to argue freedoms first without actually values, I think that's my time here at Gonzaga, and I think it's true with all Catholic education, is that we've sort of been seduced by these secondary values of freedom of speech, where we don't put them in what is the value. I think that fits in with the marketing issue is, this is what I value coffee, not that I want to go to Starbucks, but you say, this is what I value. And then there are different values in the world, but then when you put yourself in an institution, you put yourself into a value environment, you put yourself into a structure, a format, as
well, you do and you don't. Most Catholic universities, or at least most of my acquaintance or that I know anything about, for example, don't require their members to be Catholics. They don't even require their members to be Christians. They don't even require their members to be theists. So there are important senses in which we do not ask people to sign on to core values which belong to the official institutional identity. Similarly, I like your analogy with hydrochloric acid. You can't run a chemistry lab without hydrochloric acid around. And of course, hydrochloric acid is best contained in glass. And that's where you store it. Store it in glass, because glass is a nice inert subject substance relative to those kinds of acidic processes. One takes care. And here we're back to the issue of framework and of containment. what is required to contain. And certainly there are ideas which are volatile, and so we seek to contain them. But again, my own view is that we treat the members of the community with the maximum degree of presumed maturity by a more latitudinary policy that is often carried out both in this institution and its sister brother institutions. This question of value also, I think, belongs to the item in my talk we haven't yet discussed, and which we may very well not discuss today, and that is the question of implicit and explicit rules in the institution, because institutions often have real, actual values which are not expressed. In the 12 years that I've been at Gonzaga, one of the values which has seemed to me more and more evident is the desire on the part of the institution to maintain the infantile status of its members.
Particularly its faculty. Yeah. Well, this idea that the hydrochloric acid analogy, I think we may be in some agreement on this, that there are substances that are harmful if not properly contained, and there are ideas that are harmful if not properly contained. And so, and again, I think we agree on the ideal. In the ideal, the community itself has developed those mechanisms for handling destructive ideas or harmful ideas, racism, for example, sexism, other ideas that are degrading to human beings. And yet, those, just like hydrochloric acid, is necessary in order to be to have a good chemistry lab. You need to be able to discuss. You need to be able to have that racism and sexism in sort of in its potent form available for its proper use. I think the difficulty that we now face in Catholic universities, as Richard was saying, it's not an issue of that we permit people who are not Catholics to teach or to be students. What's more, there are obvious reasons why you would want to employ people other than faithful, devout Catholics. People with other faith traditions may be wonderfully gifted at teaching subjects, chemistry or English literature or other subjects where their gifts are a marvelous addition to the work of the university. I think, however, that what has happened over the years is that we have lost any sense of the distinctively Catholic mission of the institution, that there is something precious about that particular aspect of our patrimony that ought to be celebrated. Instead, we have a kind of watered down social justice, personal, cura personalis, this kind of vague generic thing that's going to sell to anybody because we don't want to offend people who would find the distinctly Catholic vision offensive. Richard and David are sick of hearing me use another analogy, which is a Chinese restaurant. If you're looking in the phone book for a Chinese restaurant and you go to the address and you show up and they have fries and bacon cheeseburgers and ravioli, you would say, wait a minute, are you prejudiced? Don't you like diversity? Yeah, I like diversity, but I wouldn't have come all this way if I wanted just the, generic spread. So, for Catholic universities, essentially to offer some generic vision seems to me to be, well, to get back to the marketing business question, kind of foolish business strategy, and a betrayal of the thing that many people assume is going to be the soul of the institution. Again, it doesn't mean that there won't be partnership with people that don't share that, but it does mean that unless you do that part of it, the soul will have gone out of the institution. Again, getting back to the comparison with Eastern has a different mission. You know, there's a difference between Costco and Starbucks. You walk into Costco expecting a different range of options compared to what what would be a good Costco is quite different from what would be a good Starbucks.
On this matter, David DeWolf and I are in large agreement, though for very different kinds of reasons. However, it seems to me that the proper place in a Catholic university for its Catholic identity, and especially for the Catholic intellectual tradition to be encountered widely, is in the curriculum. And a lot of what we're talking about when it comes to events policy, speakers policies, and like that is what we might call the co-curriculum. And here, of course, all religious-based colleges and universities have a kind of dual identity insofar as they represent an arm of the church or a particular religious tradition, and insofar as they are universities and colleges. So it seems to me that an all-comers policy when it comes to speakers and events, for example, is one way to make good on the kind of openness which we expect of universities and colleges, which may have, of course, a very different sense of its own identity and expression of that identity in its official curriculum.
You have
Yes.
a question here, over here.
Oh, I'm sorry, you've been waiting. I just had more of a point to make. I wanted to sort of combine two different analogies that were made. Dr. McClelland proposed this idea of thinking of the university as sort of being a psychoanalyst, and you had brought up the analogy of students being sort of an antibody that would fight off an infection. And so I think you could think of the psychoanalyst's role is to create sort of a self-sustaining framework for the patient so that they don't have to become dependent on the psychoanalyst. And I think that you could think of the university then as administering a vaccination when it invites someone to the campus. So it's a way for the psychoanalyst to, within this framework, create a healthy immune system in the students so that they're able to become less dependent on the psychoanalyst and ultimately, express their, or find the truth that's ultimately there. And so I think you can think of that vaccination or sponsorship as being this sort of organic or evolutionary, or as you put it, creative process that the body is fighting off this infection, or as Father Maher said, caustic substance. And I think if you think about it in a more biological sense, the body doesn't choose what pathogens it's going to be exposed to the environment. So if the psychoanalyst were to artificially select what things it's going to expose to the student artificially, then when they're actually exposed in the real world to these things, like if the student were never to see hydrochloric acid before and they just start taking a swig off of a bottle because they didn't know that is this caustic, dangerous substance. I think the same applies for the sponsorship of really any event on campus as well. So
You have a great future either as a philosopher or as a publicist.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I like your analogy.
Go ahead.
I wanted to stick with the idea of values. And originally, Dr. McClelland, I found your position attractive.
Thank you very much.
I mean, because, as a Marxist, the idea of self-determination is really important to me. But I think we can still hold on to that notion of self-determination inside certain boundaries. So, I mean, it's pretty clear, everyone agrees, ideas are powerful and they have consequences. And so instead of hydrochloric acid, I was going to go to Representative Giffords. And there's crosshairs over her district, and there's a tweet that goes out from somebody that says, don't retreat, reload, and there's consequences from the speech, okay? But then coming back to our identity of this particular institution, Kolvenbach was the former head of the Jesuits. I think it was 2002 at Santa Clara. He gave an address, what's the role of Jesuit higher education, and it boiled down to the singular purpose of Jesuit education is to do education for justice. And so I'm thinking that that maybe justice ought to be axiom for deciding what's allowed, what's not allowed. And so, I mean, I think we can still very much self-determine what that's going to be, but that would be our guiding axiom. That people's speech that stands on the side of justice would be allowed, whereas things opposed to that on the side of injustice wouldn't be allowed.
Well, I guess my difficulty is this. It seems to be important to be exposed to the ideas that those that don't stand on the side of justice, however justice may be conceived. Fascism, for example, is an unjust political philosophy. All forms of totalitarianism are. We have learned, especially in the course of the 20th century, just how costly they can be. I think we have also seen their weaknesses, which are evident on every hand. I don't see that, I would allow a fascist to come and present his philosophy because I want it exposed to the light of day. I would allow the racist to come. If the head of the Aryan nation wants to come and present his philosophy, my view is let him come. Give him enough rope, he'll hang himself. Especially at the hands of an alert, critical student body.
Notice the metaphor there, by the way. Apropos Givens. We use metaphors all. He'll give him enough rope, he'll hang himself. We use metaphors all the time, so the fact that people target a particular district doesn't mean that we mean that literally. Go ahead.
I would question, like, how far does your framework extend? Because even the U.S. government puts restrictions on free speech. For example, in Brandenburg v. Ohio, where inciting riot or certain other restrictions were placed on free speech. So I would just ask to clarify where those frameworks began and ended, because they seem to be a little bit arbitrary right now.
Yeah. Well, I don't want them to be merely arbitrary, and I do have to say that I'm not at all sure where they start and stop. One of the things I do, and David is more competent to comment on this than I am, certainly in terms of the legal matters, but there is, after all, as you're aware, a very long history of the issue about free speech in our own country, and it's a very complicated history. There was a time, for example, when it was explicitly illegal to burn draft cards in this country. And I remember this vividly because classmates of mine went to jail for having done so. And later on it was made legal. And it was made illegal in the beginning because it was held to be a threat to the smooth running of the draft policy. Therefore to interfere with a proper function of government. Similarly, all kinds there have been a wide series of swings when it comes to things like mutinous speech, or what speech was held to amount to inciting to riot and that sort of thing. I mean, we have often changed our views about these things. What I do not know, because I simply don't know enough of the cases and the details, is whether this long and complex history tends in a particular direction. I do know that there are plenty of instances of laws and so on that made one form of activity unlawful for sometimes a long period of time, and then it was later reversed. But whether the history, as I say, tends in one particular direction, I simply do not know. And again, you're asking the relevant question, because I do not know what everything is that should go into the framework. My sense is that the framework we actually operate in here at Gonzaga is much more restrictive than I feel comfortable myself.
Right.
But there it is. Now, I think you can't have an institutional life without frameworks. But I think it's extremely important to distinguish between the framework and what goes on inside it or under its aegis. Just as it's important to distinguish between Perseus' shield and any image that appears on its surface.
I think we got to quit.
Yes, we're out of time. I want to invite you to the next meeting. The Socratic Club will be on February the 18th. We'll be hearing from Dr. Rosemary Valdrup of the Philosophy Department
on the Catholic contribution to healthcare and healthcare ethics. So that's our next meeting. Let's thank our speakers again.